do wrestlers keep the blades in their fingers from cutting someone throughout the match? I've heard about taking aspirins, but does a guy have to cut a certain way to bleed more? So, to the first part of that question, Jim, I've always been interested with this stuff too. I'm sure the listeners would love to know the different ways guys stored the blade. How did more injuries, whether guys cutting themselves in the mouth or cutting their opponents, not happen?
Well, I don't fucking know, to be honest. I mean, some guys, and you would do it the way that felt most comfortable, I guess, to you, but some guys would stick it in their mouth and of course, it's not just a raw blade. I don't think I'm breaking any ground here that hadn't already been exposed. Say that it's a trimmed off corner of a razor blade wrapped in the white athletic tape like the guys use on their wrist and fingers and etc., so that you can actually hold on to it without cutting the fuck out of yourself. But it's still very small, and it requires a lot of dexterity. And then some guys make it different. Some guys, Dennis Condrey used to make them thick, to where there was so much tape wrapped around the base of it. It was thick, so you could hold on to it good. And he would tape it onto his wrist. So you tape a strip of tape over the blade, which is wrapped in tape, over the tape you've already got on your wrist. And, if you do it right, it stays there until you want it. Other guys would make it as thin, almost just one layer of tape around it, where it was almost the thickness of the blade itself. And they'd stick it in their in their mouth, in between their teeth and their lip. And they would, when needed it, they would go get it. And and then guys would put it away, and some of them would put it down in their trunks. I'm like, how they don't cut their dick off? Most people put it in between their outer trunks and their inner trunks, but I've seen everything. Flair he had tape on all of his fingers, or a lot of his fingers, and a lot of his fingers are broken anyway because the chops. And he would, on his index finger, he would put the blade sideways and a little flap of tape. And when he needed it, he'd just take his thumb and flip that flap of tape off, and right back and put the tape back over and cover it back up. But other guys like Bobby Eaton used to be scared to death people would see him using it or getting it or whatever. So sometimes he'd have me hold it. So I've got it taped to the inside pocket of my jacket. And when he takes a bump on the apron, I've got it in my hand because I've just pulled it out, and I put my hand on the apron, and he rolls over to where I am and he picks it up from there. But I didn't like doing that because I didn't want anybody to see me either. But I mean, you've always got guys. I remember the old story we first heard when we went to Mid-South. Grizzly Smith was working with Fritz one time in the 60s when Grizzly was the Kentuckian, and Fritz slaps the fucking iron claw on him. And Grizzly needs to get some juice. Like Fritz has squeezed his head so hard it popped and he's bleeding. And he reaches right over with his blade, right over the top of the claw like he's selling, and he makes his cut. But when he came up, Grizzly had all that long Kentuckian hair, right? He'd trimmed his bangs off. He had complete straight bangs across his or Kerry on the way to the ring, Super Clash, the pay-per-view they did in Chicago.
Yeah.
They had to say something like a knife-wielding fan tried to slash him because he had his blade on his finger and he scratched his armpit and cut himself. He was bleeding when he got in the ring and took his jacket off.
Yeah, he takes off the robe and you see him looking at his arm like, what's this? And it's just blood pouring out of it.
Yeah, so, I mean, shit happened. I don't know. They used to say that Ray Stevens, you could shoot him off. He could do the upside down bump into the turnbuckle, sit all the way up on the top, hit his head on the ring post, have spit the blade out into his hand, cut himself as he went over backwards, and he'd be bleeding when he landed in the ring. And I never was lucky enough to see him exactly do that, but I saw Danny Davis try to do it one time in Evansville, and he ended up going to the hospital and getting about 30 stitches across the top of his fucking forehead because the backwards upside down blading didn't go well.
We didn't have that in the Northeast. We didn't have guys trying to hide it. We had Albano and Snuka and Bruno who would just openly blade on TV, like right across from one side right to the other, just as fast as they can.
I guess they could. Did they think because the buildings were so big, nobody could really see what? I don't know. They forgot about the TV portion, but
yeah.
and there's always been. Well, there was another part of the question. The guy was asking about
aspirin.
Yes, aspirin is a blood thinner. So if you take some aspirin before, then you're more likely to bleed more. Or if you drink a beer, because alcohol gets your blood pumping, right? Well, Randy Hales getting his own angle over one time in Memphis when he was the booker. He'd like took 6 aspirin and drank 3 beers and almost bled out from a cut about an inch long. It was like, so you can go too far with these things, but that's it. It was, and then especially in TV studios, if they were doing an angle and somebody got popped and the blade flew out in the audience, well, then back in the old days, especially in the South or in Texas or whatever, the next week somebody on TV would do a hard way right in front of the audience so they could see it. Make sure they knew it was real, right? So people didn't like it when the guys didn't like it when other guys dropped their blade, because then one of them probably had to get busted open. So it was definitely more protected, and also up to the individual as how they carried it and did shit. But I don't know the number of times that I've done it. I've always been nervous about people seeing me, actually more than the actual act itself. But I have a high percentage of fuck ups. Christmas night in '94 in Knoxville at the Coliseum, I'm turning babyface when I manage the Rock and Roll Express against the Gangstas, just so the rock and roll can get even. But at the end, I turn full babyface and attack the Gangstas with the fucking racket. And of course, they get me down, hit me with the nightstick or whatever. And as I've got about where I want to go, and Mustafa did something where it either kicked me or grabbed me in the ribs or whatever, and I goosed it. I just went sideways with the thing, so I'm bleeding like a hog. And then once in the TBS studio with Heyman, he hits me with the phone. Well, it was 60 degrees. It's always cold in the studios. And I'd just been talking. I didn't really have a sweat going or anything. So I got it once and saw nothing coming and panicked. I'm like, oh shit. So I got it 3 more times. And then on the delay of cold with no heart pumping, all 4 of them came about 5 seconds later, and almost got us kicked off TV. Dusty said, I said a little juice kid. So I don't have a good track record with my swordsmanship.
How did Tommy Rich do it? Because he bled better than anyone.
Oh, good Lord. Well, part of it is just some guys have thinner skin. Some guys bleed more. I mean, some guys can drill for oil and come up with nothing. And other guys can get a pap smear and fucking gush. It just... It looks different on different people. The way they sweat, the consistency of their blood, sometimes it's thicker, sometimes it's thinner. So a lot of it is just up to genetics and luck. And I mean, Tommy definitely put the work in to bleed, but he bled naturally better than most people. And you can look at his head now and tell how hard he tried to keep that up.
In Smoky Mountain Wrestling, did you ever have to tell someone not to blade? Did you ever have someone who really wanted to do it and you had to say, like, well, this may not be the time?
Besides Boo Bradley? Yeah, and I think, I mean, I don't remember specific instances besides Boo who would have, just done anything anywhere, except maybe I don't know, Ricky Morton or Tracy Smothers at some point may have said, hey, do you want me to get a little juice? And I'm looking at it's a spot shower that's whatever. I'm like, no, we definitely needed blood because it was Tennessee wrestling, but we didn't do it just for the sake of doing it or do it in every match. Even on the big shows, as you'll recall, there was only a couple matches usually that would have any blood, even on my biggest shows of the year, because it meant more, for that match to have if nobody else or very few other people were doing it. So, but we definitely had to do it. So I'm sure sometimes a few people may have offered, and I said, but I don't think I had to talk anybody out of it really strongly.